talking about, but first I want to share with you why this particular topic came together. That was because I noticed that in this new training program, which Roger had referenced, there was the listing of these two books. They're very old books now. This is the one of them, and this is the other one. This one in particular, which will be tonight's discussion, Men Loving Men, was most of it was actually written in the early 1970s. Or the main idea of it, what comes from the early 1970s, and in its introduction it tries to explain itself a little bit as to that. That's a long time ago now. You know, this is not even, I tried to find an original copy of it, but I can't. This is actually the second printing. It went through about 13 printings that sold out. And then we decided to do a second edition. It's called an edition when you fiddle with it. If you just reproduce it as it is, it's called a reprinting. So this is a second edition of it, which is now already itself really old. This is a really old item. I brought, this is from the first printing of the second edition, 1994. Because it has a little bit of an introduction. It's not much, but it represents maybe where things have developed from this time. In terms of what Roger is talking about, how can a homosexual experience, the experience of same-sex love, be able to build on its own experience in a way that it becomes a growing form that supports and develops a deepening initiation into the meaningfulness that can be? If any of you have been exposed to, say, what I might call here homosexual values in, for example, culture, history, throughout time and place, one will discover that there are very powerful actualities to be had in homosexual love. It's not simply, as it might be thought of today, a mere matter of the genital interest, or what may be called in the West, quote, sex, unquote. It's that way such that what you and I might call homosexual persons here in the West might be denied in other cultures to exist in those other cultures, okay? And it wouldn't be that, at least when I can sense that, sometimes it's due to homophobic influence, but sometimes it's due to mistranslation that in many other cultures what we call sex is not thought of or considered in that way that we think of it as, quote, sex, unquote, as a separate category involving the genitals and their own interests, as if that's separate from other things in reality. In most other cultures, not particularly in this kind of cultural environment, like where we're sitting tonight, for example, but that I've experienced in most other cultures, things are more connected. Different parts of reality or experience are more connected than they tend to get handled in a westernized kind of approach, or a western kind of approach. And that goes for what we might call here being homosexual, which is we might call a personal identity based on a form of desire, an interest in a kind of desire. And you see how it is that in the culture we are all born into and grow up into, that's poo-pooed at best. None of the rich heritage and lineage of this greatness of what this desire can mean and what can amount to is it all left over from the ravages of Roger mentioned easy 1,000 years of not just ideological opposition to anything that might be called homosexually centric. It is centered on any kind of homosexual experience, but murderous, physically murderous. So 1 year after this book came out, Men Loving Men, a friend of mine at the time named Arthur Evans, who just died 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, wrote a book about this stuff in which he discusses the word faggot. And he does a whole historical analysis in which he uncovers this kind of story in which homosexuals were used as part of the kindling to burn other kinds of heretics during the Middle Ages. He uses different examples to show that kind of idea, and it's hard to imagine now what it might be like, not even so much in 1977 when this book came out, but when it was first conceived of, what things were like at that time for homosexual folks. If you want to go further with it, that stuff that Roger is talking about, that gradually has become, relatively speaking, in some places like here in West Hollywood, easier to do. It's still a big achievement, and not so long ago, something like this was a big deal. even though it was in a small world, this world where people dared to call themselves homosexual up frontly, and it wasn't apologetic anymore. Even in the 60s, if you dared to be public, mainly you had to be apologetic unless you were overtly, like Frank Kameny was. He was fired from the government. He was a government employee. And he was fired for being homosexual. They found out he was homosexual, and he decided to make trouble for them. He decided to sue them rather than just, as most gays who were fingered did, go along with it. He fought back and filed a lawsuit against the government for firing him as homosexual, and went on for like 18 years or something like that. It's very well known because eventually he won the point, which was really a philosophical point at heart, not even really a legal one, which is if I can put it really boldly, are homosexual people. But we're going to treat them in that way as people, rather than if they dare to say this thing. And that's that simple level of that, much less developing a psychology of that, of self-awareness of that understands that. That's to go even further, to begin to build on that kind of thing is real curious. So I noticed that this book was on the reading list for the training program. I noticed it's not really quite a sequel, but it's a book called Visionary Love. 1980 comes out after that, so that's going to be the topic next month. If I can read you the blurb, you'll get more of an idea of what more we're going to get into. And especially, why is this called Part 1 and Part 2, right? So today we're going to talk about this book here. Okay. By the way, I have a couple spare copies that I want to pass around. Can you take that, Enrique? It's the second edition, but it's really the same text. If you want to browse through it, if you haven't seen it, in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, you can see what it looked like in 1994, which is the same drawings and pretty much the same text. We've rearranged the order. It's the original is before AIDS, so you have to understand what it was like before there was HIV. It may seem a very different world because it is. And it's maybe very hard to convey how these matters would be handled. Like, for example, in the original edition of Men Loving Men, the health section, which would deal with questions like HIV, is way back in the text, because that's how it was handled. That's how sexually transmitted diseases were handled back then. You went to a gay-identified doctor. This is a time when, after 1969, and before AIDS changed everything. Okay, that was when the original was done, and so the one I'm passing around is 1994. And by that time, it's been terrible how folks have been decimated, terribly decimated. And the hundreds and hundreds of people that be dying all the time in the early years, and sometimes terrible conditions from HIV. I mean, requisite that a book like this be adjusted for that. So after the introduction, which in here we go right into, the book is about different ways of having gay men together having sex. It would go right in the new edition, it would go right into the sex. It goes right into precautions against sharing HIV. And it's reflecting that time. You have to know, if it's interesting at all, it's because of knowing what that time would be like, where they're beginning to experiment with drugs to try and handle this stuff. But it's still iffy. You know, it's since gradually become more secure in their handling of HIV, though it's still a terrible thing. Okay, but I want you to be aware of this context on account of what we're going to get into. Okay, so I'm going to read you the blurb that goes with tonight's talk first. The title is On the Road to a Gay-Centered Psychology, Part 1, The Genesis and Significance of This Book, Men Loving Men, which was published in early 1977. I'm going to talk about it for a while, and then hopefully you all can get stimulated in various ways. We can try and have a conversation in terms of what Roger talked about, having more of a sense of the club than just someone who comes and talks for a while. I'm not trying, and be careful and watch the time this time, not just talk on about things that come to mind because they all get so interesting. They've never been talked about. That's one reason of having the tape here, you know, recording this kind of babble, which otherwise is silly to do, we might say, it actually relates to things that are of significance, whether or not it seems that way. So the blurb goes, for tonight goes, as Mitch Walker struggled in young adulthood to come out of the closet as homosexual, as not only not fighting what he was on that kind of level, but how was he gonna take that in and be with that integratively as a real decent person as homosexual, right? So, as Mitch Walker struggled in young adulthood to come out of the closet as homosexual, he also became increasingly interested in combining his long-time interest in psychology with his growing gay sensibility. It's a peculiar thing to want to put those together if you're of the time I'm talking about versus now, when we've had decades of things developing out of such topics. But in the beginning, it was not like that. This book we're going to get into tonight, Men Loving Men, was a result of an early result of this interest in combining. When I was 13 years old, I made my mother take me to the first person I ever came out to was a psychologist. She was a nice lady at the child guidance clinic. And that was the very first person I came out to, because I told my mother I had a problem one night. I wouldn't tell her what the problem was. And I couldn't figure it out in my own head. I felt haunted by being homosexual. I hated being homosexual. I loved being homosexual. I needed to deal with it, and I wanted to get rid of it. It was something I was feeling, though. I didn't want to talk to my mother about it, so I told her I needed someone to talk to about it. I want a psychologist. And why I said psychologist was because even at 13, I was interested in not that word psychology as some stupid term, but rather what that word refers to, which is how one thinks and feels and experiences experience, and knowledge thereof, understanding, and thus consciousness. It's always been my interest, and from the time I'm 13, I've been interested in psychology, and even though I didn't have ongoing therapy, I was put in a group and it fell apart after a while, and they invited me to go into some other group. It was so lame. I had no interest until after I graduated from high school, when I started a more formal kind of individual therapy at the age of 18 to try and become straight, to try and become a straight man, you know, but and I fell in love again and got the guy anyway, in spite of it. It was like love was insisting that it was not going to be murdered in me, even though I loathed my own self for having this kind of life. And so I stopped fighting it off. And it took me a while then to come to terms with not merely fighting it off, but once I'd been able to do that enough, that I wasn't merely feeling like shit all the time for being homo. It's nothing queer. That's in the old days, before queer was used as a political term, I could see myself calling myself queer in that bad sense, or the word faggot, which was abrogated at an earlier time as a political tool against oppressive forces. The use of faggot was not a put down. But it was really crappy to try and feel good about yourself as a homosexual, even for someone like me, born in 1951, middle of the last century. It was a horrifying world. You were hunted down and killed. Now, the reason that there were a few brave folks like Harry Hay, and he'd only really started to become outrageously pro-homo identity in like 1948, and so 1947, 48, was because the state gives an appearance of not having totalitarian control over its citizens because it claims to be a democracy. So you don't get just machine gunned on the street around that stuff. If you know how to work with it, Harry was an old pro. He's a toughie. He could survive. It wasn't easy to do. I'm not suggesting it's easy for him. As you know, the Communist Party, which he was a member of at that time, kicked him out. He insisted he was not going to go back in the closet. He was a homosexual person, as well as other things, other qualities, other aspects. He was a homosexual person, and the party said, you either renounce that, or you give us back your card of your membership.